So thank you, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Leah Watkis. My pronouns are she, her. I am currently the chair of the Collaborative Network to End Exploitation, who is putting on this Do No Harm webinar series. For those of you, if anyone can't see me, I'm in my mid-30s. I have very pale skin. I have medium long hair that's kind of the color of ginger. And I'm sitting in front of a bookcase. We have people joining us virtually from all over Turtle Island. Us as facilitators, we are speaking to you here in Toronto, which was formerly called Tekaronto, which has been home to many nations since time immemorial. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. These nations were harmed by the arrival of European settlers who have systematically tried to erase these Indigenous communities and their teachings. Colonialism and racism are deeply entrenched in the Canadian state. Collaborative Network to End Exploitation strives to decolonize our work and make a positive contribution to the reconciliation process. And at this time, I would invite all of you, our participants, to use the chat feature and to share with us your name, your pronouns, where you're joining us from, and whose territory it is. I would also like to acknowledge the labor and sacrifices of poor and racialized workers on these lands. Canada's settler colonial history includes, among others, the exploitation of labor of over 200 years of enslaving African and Indigenous peoples, charging an immigration head tax on any person of Chinese origin, agricultural and other migrant workers indentured to their employers with closed work permits. These and other violent practices have allowed Canada to accumulate wealth and power. Canada continues to profit from the historic and ongoing exploitation of poor and racialized people. CNEE is committed to doing our part to redress this legacy. A couple of housekeeping pieces. You will be muted and we'll be disabling chat for the formal presentation portion today. You can private message with the host. So there's myself, there's my colleague Varga Kalajieva, who's also from CNEE, so you'll see her name at the top of the list. So feel free to send us private messages if you have any questions or comments during the presentation. We'll turn the chat feature back on at the end of the presentation so that you can engage with our speaker and one another and ask questions. We are recording this event, and you will have access to the recording later. Cart captions. Are we set up now with cart captions, Varka?
No, the caption is not here yet.
So unfortunately, today the cart captions are not available, but we'll make sure when I'm done this portion, I'll be checking the settings and making sure that you can at least try and turn on the automatic captioning feature that Zoom provides. Sorry, our sincere apologies for that. So today is the fourth part of our Do No Harm webinar series. So hopefully most of you have joined us for one or all of our previous sessions. Today we are learning about sex trafficking and Black girls, an intersectional examination of racial disparities in victimization and identification. And then we will be having two further webinars that I hope you'll be joining us for as well. It's the same Zoom link, same bat time, same bat channel for those part of my generation. So yeah, same time, same day, same link if you want to join us in the next 2 weeks for our other sessions. Group assumptions. We are assuming that if you're joining us today, you are already familiar with the topic of human trafficking and what anti-human trafficking work entails. So we're not doing human trafficking 101. We're going to kind of jump straight in with both feet to this topic. We assume that you are here with good intentions, that you want to learn more, that you've signed up for this because you're curious, because you're aware that there may be some harms that are happening because of your work. And so we welcome you to this space of learning. We understand that discomfort is a part of growth, and there may be some things that our presenters share that make you feel uncomfortable. And we encourage you to lean into that discomfort and find the opportunities for learning therein. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Rhonelle Bruder. So Rhonelle this is her second time speaking in the Do No Harm series. She did speak to us in our first round a year ago. After Rhonelle's taken over, maybe Varka, can you put that link in the chat to Rhonelle's last presentation so folks can find that. Rhonelle Bruder is a passionate and highly regarded professional with over a decade of experience as an advocate for women who have been impacted by sexual and physical violence, including human trafficking, child abuse, and intimate partner violence. She is the founder and executive director of Project iRISE, an anti-trafficking agency supporting women impacted by sex trafficking. As well as leading Project iRISE, Rhonelle is also a PhD student in social and behavioral sciences at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Her research centers on human trafficking, gender violence, and women's health. She holds a Master of Science in Health Informatics from the University of Victoria and an Honors Bachelor of Science in Health Sciences Administration from New York City College of Technology. So thank you so much, Rhonelle. We are delighted to have you here today. I'm going to stop screen share and I'm going to bring up your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Varka and Leah. It is a pleasure to be back to the Do No Harm web series. I had the opportunity to present at last year's session on survivor leadership and empowerment, and I'm excited to be back here to share some of my work on trafficking as it pertains to Black women. I'm also the founder and executive director of Project iRISE, a Toronto-based anti-trafficking agency, and I'm finishing up my first year of doctoral studies at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. I come to the space of anti-trafficking work as a researcher, a service provider, an activist, and also as a survivor. Through this vantage point, I have a very unique perspective on this topic, but I also recognize that my experiences are uniquely mine. And so this presentation is not about my personal lived experiences, but rather a culmination of my extensive research on this topic. Through the presentation, we'll try to unpack the unique gendered and racial oppression experienced by Black women by first understanding the historical origins of sex trafficking in North America, a history that is so intertwined with that of Black women and Black bodies. We'll also examine the present day structural systems of oppression that lead to both the hypervisibility of Black women, but also the invisibility of Black women. And lastly, I will share some trauma and survivor-informed approaches to care. Okay. So let's begin. So why Black women? Why are we focusing on Black women, especially when we know trafficking can happen to people of all backgrounds, races, genders, and religions? And while this is true, it can happen to anybody. It does happen to Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color at disproportionate rates. In his exploration of trafficking at the intersections, Robert Nomomero writes, Black women experience human trafficking as Black women, not simply as women. So Black women face sexual violence under patriarchy. They're also simultaneously experiencing racism under white supremacy. Furthermore, in her book, The Voices of Black Girls in Toronto, Leanna James writes, Black women in Canada are subjected to significant levels of sexual violence and coercion with little to no support. But I think the most significant reason why we need to have this conversation is to date, we know very little about Black women and trafficking, their vulnerabilities, their experiences, and the challenges they face while exiting and trying to rebuild their lives. And with very little data that we have, the very little data that we do have demonstrates that Black women are more likely to experience sexual violence. So they're experiencing this at higher rates than their counterparts, but they're less likely to report these incidences. And when they do report them, they're less likely to be believed. So in the context of trafficking, I believe this is partly to blame because of much of the work that we've done within anti-trafficking to date has been through a colorblind lens, one that perpetuates a single narrative on trafficking victimization and that excludes victims that are not sort of the ideal victim. So white, cisgender, young females. And so the experiences of Black women, Indigenous women, men, people from the trans community and immigrants are often outrightly ignored within the broader context of anti-trafficking work. And so today's presentation, as I said at the beginning, is going to look at trafficking through an intersectional lens. And so it's important that we engage in anti-trafficking work. We do this through intersectional approaches. So what is intersectionality? Many of you have probably heard of this term. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar. And she defines this as a way to help us understand how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. And if you look at the screen, you can see within those bubbles, there's different identities, social identities. So we have religion, disability, class, trauma, relational status, gender, sexual identity, and race. And so these intersecting identities, they interlock to create systems of oppression, but also systems of privilege. Regarding sex trafficking, intersectionality provides a unique theoretical approach to examining this notion of homogeneity within experiences of women who've been trafficked. So the idea that everyone's experiences will be the same. It highlights the significance of structural inequalities and the systems of oppression stemming from these different intersecting identities, such as gender, race, class, and how they overlap to have a cumulative effect on people's lives and experiences. Intersectionality also calls us to center the most marginalized voices. So this can sometimes be misinterpreted as a zero-sum fallacy. So the idea that if we are focusing so much on one group and putting all our efforts and resources into one group, will somehow be less for another group. But this is just categorically wrong. We can address trafficking at a very general level, understanding how vulnerability looks and providing services for victims and survivors of trafficking. But in tandem, we can also create specified supports for groups that have been identified as highly vulnerable to exploitation, such as Black women. So to first begin this examination of sex trafficking of Black women, we need to go back in history. We need to look at the historical factors that have led to Black women's vulnerability to trafficking. And to do that, we need to look at the Atlantic slave trade, which was the first experiences of labor trafficking and sex trafficking within North America. And again, something that is so interlocked with Black women and Black bodies. And this quote that we have here on Martin Luther King, I think really highlights the idea that we have to first look at the past. To understand the present, we must understand the past, otherwise we risk repeating it. So slavery in Canada. Going to guess that you've all heard of the transatlantic slave trade, where 10 to 12 million Africans were brought through the Atlantic Ocean and enslaved between the 16th and 19th centuries. But what many people may not know is Canada's role within chattel slavery, because that part of our history has been, for the most part, glossed over for this prevailing narrative that slavery was a sin of the United States. Even I remember as a child growing up and learning about slavery in school, it was always that America enslaved Black people and that they escaped through the Underground Railroad to Canada for their freedom. And this is true, this did happen. But what also happened was that Canada also had slaves. Not nearly as many slaves as in the United States. It's estimated there was about 4,200 slaves in Canada between 1671 and 1834. 2/3 of those slaves were Indigenous and 1/3 were Black. During this time of slavery and enslavement of Black people, racial constructs were created to justify slavery and colonization. So chattel slavery wasn't only an exploitation of labor, it also created and perpetuated the sexual exploitation of Black women's bodies through a very racialized sexual exploitation of Black women. And this took several forms and had several purposes. But how this was able to be justified was by creating an idea, a myth around Black women and Black women's bodies, a myth that would then justify any form of sexual violence that would be perpetrated to Black women, with the understanding that Black women were already very hypersexualized, were always eager to engage in sex, and so therefore they could never be sexually exploited. And so this myth that was created was that of the Jezebel myth. The Jezebel myth was used to justify the exploitation of Black slaves. So white society created Black women as Jezebels. So Jezebels were framed as innately promiscuous, immoral, and with an insatiable appetite for sex. Slave owners used the Jezebel stereotype to justify their unlimited access to Black women's bodies, and also to force Black women to be breeders of slave children. Additionally, slave owners would bribe Black women by offering them small amounts of money for sexual services. In doing so, they felt that this absolved them of any wrongdoing, and therefore painted Black women as prostitutes for accepting this money or favors in exchange for sexual services. Of course, the reality is any slave who refused any sort of sexual advances would be risked being beaten, being raped, being killed, having her children sold. So this forced Black women in a predicament that they were forced to concede to these sexual relations, thereby reinforcing the belief that Black women were hypersexualized creatures and that they lacked sort of any morality surrounding sex and sexual relations. One story, one in particular that stands out as really, I would say, epitomizes the exploitation and the commodification, dehumanization of Black women's body is that of Saartjie Baartman. So Saartjie Baartman was born in 1789 in South Africa. She was kidnapped from her homeland and forced on display throughout Europe as some sort of a freak show attraction. So she was sent on circuses where Europeans would come and look and mock and gawk at her body. Even after her death in 1815, she was continually sexually exploited when French doctors preserved her genitals and in glass jars, and they were on display until 1976, her genitalia, until finally it was returned back home to her family and she was allowed a proper burial. This idea of the hypersexualized Black woman, the Jezebel, is something that persists today. It's something that continues and contributes to the false narrative surrounding Black women, which we see within mainstream media and culture. And so if we look at some of these images, we see this hypersexualized Jezebel very much within media and very much within presentations of Black women, particularly within the hip hop industry. And so when I see these, this is not in any way to sort of denigrate these women, these Black women who are artists, who are trying to build their careers, who are trying to create financial stability for themselves. Instead, what it is an understanding that these images are reinforcing this idea of the Jezebel, and that oftentimes Black female musicians are rewarded for these overly sexual performances, and sometimes even punished if they are unwilling to engage in this. So one case is a singer, India Irie, who's very famous in the late 90s, sort of Afrocentric soul music, who describes how her record label pushed her to really sexualize her image. She was not comfortable with that, refused to do it, and therefore was punished, was dropped from her label, and her music was no longer in rotation and being played. And so this image of Black women, we still very much see today. It's very much the central image that we see displayed of Black women, and it helps create and reinforce that narrative of, again, the Jezebel. What's interesting is when we think of how Black women have been presented, have been socialized throughout history, and we compare that to white women, particularly when we go back to slavery and within the anti-trafficking movement. And so white slavery was a term that started within the early 20th century. So while Black female slaves were being exoticized, were being exploited, white women were being held as the epitome of womanhood, of virtue. And post-slavery, fears started to spread of white women being kidnapped off the streets, being smuggled across the country and forced into prostitution, oftentimes by immigrant and foreign men. And so what came from that was the White Slave Act, or the Mann Act, that was enacted in 1910. The act meant to eradicate trafficking, but there was clear racial inequities within its application. So whether it was barring immigration of women of color or using the law to punish Black men for having relations with white women. And these were consenting relationships. There was and through the research, I discovered a story of a Black boxer who was actually charged through the Mann Act because he took his white wife across state lines, and he was charged with white slavery. So as you can see, white women were being held as a symbol of purity and virtue and being protected, and Black women were being forced into prostitution, oftentimes, most often, as a means of economic survival. So this ideal white womanhood was dependent on the denigration of Black womanhood. We needed to have someone to look up to, therefore we needed to have someone that we needed to fear, someone that we needed to denigrate. But it's important to note that these stereotypes of white womanhood, of Black womanhood, are damaging to both Black women and white women. So they held white women in unrealistic standards. Their bodies were also being controlled by their fathers, by their husbands. It denied them agency, the right to their own sexuality, autonomy, and really it ignored the true perpetrator of their oppression, which was patriarchy. So patriarchy, the system of patriarchy, was oppressing Black women and white women in different ways. Black women were then also being oppressed through white supremacy. And so we think about this ideal victim of anti-trafficking, one, again, that came through the white slavery, the Mann Act. We see this idea of white women, again, being centered as the victim of trafficking. And so if you look at this image, it's an image that actually was found, and it talked about sort of white women in the grip of the slave trader. So this idea that trafficking was something that impacted white women and white women only. And so it's been 100 years, over 100 years since the Mann Act was enacted, but this narrative of who is the victim of trafficking really has not changed at all, right? So we look at modern day, so current, I just did a Google search of human trafficking, and this imagery is still very much prevalent. So the idea of the ideal trafficking victim is, again, white, female, cisgender, and young. And so this can really be summed up to by McKinney Chisholm-Straker, who writes in The Historical Roots of Human Trafficking that present day anti-trafficking victimhood status is reserved for, if not in law, in rhetoric, for a single racial group. And so despite the fact that we have over 100 years from when the White Slavery Act was enacted, the idea of who needs to be protected when we talk about trafficking has not changed. And that again is centered on one single group and not actually representative of who is being victimized by trafficking, historically and presently. So one other thing when we talk about trafficking and the history of trafficking brings me to this term, modern day slavery. So I know this is a term we've probably all heard. It's a term that I can say that I've even said myself in the past, repeating it from other people, but again, recognizing that there was something inaccurate with this term. And so I really want to understand what made this term so problematic. And so modern day slavery is a flawed way to describe human trafficking. Slavery, as we know, has existed for thousands of years, but race-based enslavement, as seen in the transatlantic slave trade, introduced a form of slavery that was unique. It was commercialized, it was racialized, and it was inherited. Slavery, and probably the most important element that differentiates slavery, chattel slavery, and human trafficking, is that slavery was a legal institution in the United States until 1865. Human trafficking is illegal. It is a criminal enterprise. It is illegal in every country in the world. It is done by criminals, by bad actors, but it is illegal. The term slave is still very much racially coded in North America. And so when we co-opt this term to describe human trafficking, we see the minimization of people of color in anti-trafficking efforts and literature. But anti-trafficking movement was not born in a vacuum, but instead it's built off of pre-existing frameworks that has, as I described previously, explicitly been concerned with white women being coerced into the sex trade. So and through the construction of the white sex slave ideas and the hysteria that was established around sort of white women being trafficked, the ideal victim of trafficking has been reverberated into the current anti-trafficking movement. And this has isolated and excluded women of color and excluded anyone that does not fit into that narrative. And so I highly recommend that anybody who still uses this term do your own homework and really understand why this is so inappropriate. Well, first off, not only incorrect, but also that it is co-opting a term, again, that describes the horrific abuses, exploitation of African Americans throughout North America that is different from what we see today in human trafficking. So this next slide, we have Angela Davis. I'm sure many of you know her as an activist, a scholar, and academic. She's done a lot of work she's done a lot of work talking about Black women, intersectionality, and how gender and race and class intersect. So in this next area, we're going to talk about socioeconomic status and how socioeconomic status relates into. And so for this next section, we're going to be examining the social structural factors that increase Black women's vulnerability to trafficking, but also obscure them as victims of trafficking. And so in this slide, we have American political activist, philosopher, academic scholar, and author Angela Davis. Angela Davis has done extensive work on intersectionality as it pertains to race, class, and gender. So when we think about those social structural factors that increase the vulnerability, Black women's vulnerability to trafficking, one of the first things we look at is socioeconomic status. And so Black women's socioeconomic status is one that is often lower than their counterparts. Black women are more likely to experience poverty than their racial counterparts. Traffickers tend to target individuals, particularly Black women, because of the low socioeconomic status and the vulnerabilities that come with that. And due to their low socioeconomic status, many victims are less likely to leave their situations. So on this slide, we have American political activist, philosopher, academic scholar, and author Angela Davis. Tells us that if we do not know how to meaningfully talk about racism, our actions will move in misleading directions. And so for our next slides, we're going to be examining the social structure and institutional systems of oppression that increase the vulnerability and invisibility of Black women as victims of trafficking. So first, we look at the socioeconomic status. And so Black girls are more likely to experience poverty than their racial counterparts. Traffickers tend to target individuals, target Black women because of their low socioeconomic status. And due to this low status, many victims are less likely to leave their situations. So on this next slide, we have American political activist, philosopher, academic, scholar, and author, Angela Davis. And she says, if we do not know how to meaningfully talk about racism, our actions will move in misleading directions. So the next few slides will examine the structural and institutional systems of oppression that increase the vulnerability and invisibility of Black women as victims of trafficking. So first off, we look at socioeconomic status. So one's socioeconomic status is the top contributor to increasing their chances of sex trafficking. Black women are more likely to experience poverty than their racial counterparts. Traffickers tend to target individuals, Black women, because of their low socioeconomic status. And due to this low status, many victims are less likely to leave their situation. The child welfare system. Child welfare involvement, specifically out-of-home foster care placement, is one of the top contributors in increasing the chances of sex trafficking. In a 2018 report by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, they found that African Canadian children were admitted into care, 2.2 times higher than in proportion to their child population, than their population as So in this next slide, we have American political activist, philosopher, academic, scholar, and author, Angela Davis. And she says that if we do not know how to meaningfully talk about racism, our actions will move in misleading directions. So next few slides, we're going to examine the structural and institutional systems of oppression that increase the vulnerability and invisibility of Black women as victims of trafficking. So first thing we're looking at is socioeconomic status. So your socioeconomic status is one of the top contributors in increasing the chances of sex trafficking. Black women are more likely to experience poverty than their racial counterparts. Traffickers tend to target their victims, particularly Black women, because of their low socioeconomic status. And due to this low status, many victims are less likely to be able to leave their situation and rebuild their lives. Next, the child welfare system. Child welfare involvement, specifically out-of-home foster care placement, is one of the top contributors in increasing the chances of sex trafficking. In a 2018 report by the Ontario's Human Rights Commission, they found that African Canadian children were admitted into care 2.2 times higher than their proportion in the child population. African Canadian children are more likely to be referred to Children's Aid Society by educators, police, medical professionals. And also, that African Canadian children are more likely to be removed from their homes, less likely to be returned to their families, and more likely to grow up in foster care without being adopted or finding a permanent home. And as stated earlier, child welfare involvement is another one of the top contributors for increasing someone's likelihood of being a victim of trafficking. Next, the education system. So the education system, specifically the over-policing of Black girls within the educational system, is what we're focusing on here. So due to discipline policies that push Black girls out of the education system, they're more likely to enter into the juvenile justice system, otherwise known as the school to prison pipeline. Anti-Black racism plays a role within how Black girls are disciplined in the classroom and their interactions with authority figures, even though statistically they have not been misbehaving more than their counterparts. 42% of Black students have been suspended at least once by the time they finish high school. And lastly, we'll look at the adultification of Black girls. As compared to white girls of the same age, Black girls are viewed as in less need of nurturing, protection, support, comfort. They're seen as more independent and to know more about topics such as sex. And so the Center for Poverty and Inequality created a study. And in this study, they were looking at adults' views of Black girls and how these views create this sort of adultification. So where Black girls are seen as more adult-like than their counterparts. Due to many of these contributing characteristics that are sort of subscribed to Black girls, this may, and in the report, suggest influence how law officials criminalize Black girls rather than seeing them as victims. So how they're treated differently within the educational systems and within child welfare systems. This is important because when we think about who is seen as or identified as a victim of trafficking versus someone who is potentially seen as engaging in willful sex work, oftentimes that ideal victim comes back into play. And particularly when Black girls are being adultified or seen as more adult-like. And this adultification starts quite young. Within the research, it states that Black girls as young as 11 are seen as being more sexually advanced than their counterparts. But I think the most sort of egregious thing about the adultification of Black girls is that it deprives them of their innocence, their ability to just be children, to just grow up and enjoy girlhood. Instead, they're seen as over-sexualized, they're seen as overly aggressive, they're seen and treated as adults, when in fact they are still children. One case study that I found in doing this research particularly looked at race and racial tensions among African-American women, and particularly within care and in practice. And this found that Black women's experiences of racism when accessing services, that the existence and manifestation of racial tensions in practice. So they did in-depth interviews with 30 adult women who had traded sex as adults and 20 commercial sexual exploitation related service providers. The findings suggested that Black women perceived preferential treatment given to white women, and they identified this as potentially a promising practice of intergroup dialogue and actually addressing racism, privilege, and oppression. And so there was perceptions of these Black women within the study that they were being treated differently because they were Black. And they were identifying that there was preferential treatment. But the study also recognizes that there's something promising here. The ability to have these discussions of race, of racial bias among service providers is a way to move forward. But first, we have to sort of address this racism and these unconscious biases that do exist. And so, of course, we have the amazing Maya Angelou, Project iRISE. So my nonprofit is actually named after her. So the poem Still I Rise, we've named Project iRISE. This poem, particularly, which is one of my favorites, I think is so grounded in the idea of Black women as being strong and resilient and overcoming trauma and overcoming hardship. And while I love this poem, I think that narrative is also quite damaging. So society has sort of developed and perpetuated this narrative, this idea as Black women, we're always strong, always resilient. But this resiliency has saddled Black women, and Black women are perceived as needing of less assistance, compassion, patience, understanding, because again, they're strong, they are resilient. And so when we keep perpetuating this myth of the strong Black woman, it makes it easier, right? And even acceptable to overlook Black women as victims, to overlook the needs that they have. Black women are never given the opportunity or afforded the luxury of being seen as a victim. Instead, this strong Black women trope seems to be present throughout the entire life of a Black woman. And that again is doing a great disservice to Black women and doing tremendous disservice to Black girls. I'm going to look at another case study. And so in this case study, it was looking at different modalities, different treatment methods to support Black women who have been victimized by commercial sex trafficking. And so looked at different things they can look at. So different cultural barriers to care, different treatment services, the importance of trauma-informed care when providing services, the importance of having other mentors, particularly survivor mentors, and exposing African-American females to these role models, the importance of having culturally competent care and being engaged into spirituality and spiritual care, and providing those supports that they will need when exiting trafficking and recognizing poverty, discrimination, and oppression, and all those other things that will be saddled on them as they try to rebuild their lives and heal. But there's one part of this, and that is trauma-informed care. But again, I kind of want to tease out a little bit and talk about. So it's important, we always hear, again, this is a term we hear often, trauma-informed care, and something particularly with service providers is at the forefront of the way people engage, particularly within victims of trauma, survivors of sex trafficking. But what does it really mean to be trauma-informed and to provide trauma-informed care? And so I was reading a paper from Dr. Corleen Griffin Hunt, and she's an award-winning trauma psychologist. And I think she states this perfectly, that you're not trauma-informed if you're not culturally informed. So to be trauma-informed and to do this work, you also have to be culturally informed. So you have to be culturally competent, and you have to have cultural humility within your work, right? So culturally competent, so you have to be able to sort of understand and interact with other people's and understand the people's beliefs and their culture. But you also have cultural humility. You have to be able to be teachable, be willing to learn and unlearn what you know, and understand that there are limitations to your competence. You don't know everything. And so the three tenets of cultural humility: lifelong learning and self-reflection, mitigating power imbalances, and institutional accountability. I think this is really important in the work that we're doing within anti-trafficking, particularly when we're working with historically marginalized communities, understanding that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, that what may work for one person may not work for another. But also to recognize that even within these groups, even within a group as such as Black women, they're not a monolith. Every single person is different. So because it worked with one Black woman doesn't mean it worked with everybody. So really taking the time to do that work, to understand clients, to understand victims and survivors, and really listen and hear what they're saying and provide the support that they need, not the support that we think they need. And so some other sort of suggestions in doing this work and doing this work in a way that is not only trauma informed, but really survivor informed, is nothing about us without us. So this work needs to be done that is collaborative. We cannot be doing for people. We cannot save people. Instead, we have to work alongside people. Excuse me. And so when we're talking about researchers, one way a couple different things that we can include is, one, if you're engaging with Black clients, it's not always to have them as your study, a participant in your study, but actually a collaborator within this work. It's to create mentorship opportunities as a peer researcher, help guide and mentor people. And if you're doing research, and particularly research around Black community, Black survivors, Black victimization, it's recognize your own positionality, right? Be reflexive. Ask yourself, is this the right topic for me to be leading? Am I the right person to lead this research? And if I am, how will this research be disseminated? How will this research be really shared with the broader audience? How can this research help actually enact change within anti-trafficking movement? And for service providers, ensure you're hiring staff that is reflective of the community that you serve. So this means diversity in all levels, not just entry level, but in senior levels of management. Avoid using imagery and language that perpetuates stereotypes around trafficking. So we did that Google search and we looked at sort of the ideal victim. Avoid doing that. Any sort of language such as modern day slavery or imagery should actually be a depiction of what trafficking looks like and what victimization looks like. And make sure your programming and services are informed by people with lived experience. So inviting people with lived experience to the table to help do that work. Don't just bring them in at the end when you're done as sort of like a checkbox item, but actually throughout the whole inception, implementation, execution phase, really make this a collaborative effort. It's important if we're really truly committed to fighting human trafficking, we have to recognize this is not simply a criminal justice issue. This is also a racial justice issue. Therefore, our anti-trafficking responses must embed racial justice, equity into the policies, our programs, and really we have to work to dismantle structural inequalities and challenge these implicit biases that we all have, right? We have to challenge the tropes of the Jezebel, and we have to center marginalized voices and experiences. Okay, so I'm done the presentation. If you have any questions, if you want to get in touch, if you want to sort of follow up on any of these discussions that we had today, please feel free to reach out to me. You can visit me. So we have Project iRISE, our website, www.projectirise.org, my personal website, rhonnellebruder.com. You can email me directly at rbruder@projectirise.org, and also visit me on Twitter, Instagram @RealRhonelle. I'm also on LinkedIn at Rhonelle Bruder. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if there's anything else that you'd like to explore about this conversation. So thank you again for having me. I'm truly honored to be back at the Do No Harm web series. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation, to talk about human trafficking as it pertains to Black women and girls, and really the importance of doing intersectional work within anti-trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonelle, for that wonderful presentation. And especially as I mentioned already, Rhonelle was a speaker for us last year. And she spoke especially to that notion of how we can more authentically and truly engage and hold up survivors in real and practical ways. So that's a great talk for you to go back and look at as well. So now we do have some time for about 15 minutes for some questions and comments. I know, Varka, you've been monitoring that chat for us.
There are no questions yet. There's only one comment related to cultural competency and cultural humility. That the tendency now is to move further towards cultural humility because we will never be competent in someone's culture. But also I'm inviting people to open up their microphones and just speak on the microphone as well.
Yes, you can raise let me make sure, yeah. Okay, yes, now participants can unmute themselves as well. So if you would prefer to speak up, you're welcome to do that. I've got a question here. You were speaking earlier in your presentation about the sexualization and fetishization of Black women, especially in the music industry. When Black women themselves present themselves in that way, is that self-empowerment?
So again, I don't feel I'm in the position to sort of speak to everybody and all Black women. But I would say that, if to participate in an industry, you are sort of directed to sort of create an image and present yourself a certain way, I don't know how empowering that is. I don't know if you guys know an artist named iRISE. She was a big artist, sort of late 90s, early 2000s. She spoke about how, when she entered into the space, and she has a very Afrocentric, appeal and brand, how she was being pushed by her team become more sexual. be more sexual, straighten her hair, have a very Eurocentric look and style. And she refused. She refused to do that, and she was punished. She was punished by being dropped by her label. She was punished by not getting airtime.
I've got a note here that I need to speak up, so I will try to do that. There's some more comments here. Competence and humility need to go hand in hand. They do not oppose each other. They are complementary.
Absolutely.
There's another comment here. I loved this presentation, found it so amazing. I think having that historical context was so important, and really appreciated the presentation coming from this perspective. I found it really helpful, and it gave me a lot to consider, mull over, and think about how I need to grow and hold myself accountable in this work while working, specifically with Black women. Thank you again. I look forward to accessing the resources you are making available to us. That's great. Do you have any data?
And this oh, no, go. I'll go.
Nope.
No, see, and this is what this presentation was about. It was to sort of bring things that maybe present to people's attention that they weren't aware of. Talking about the historical context of sex trafficking, within Canada, within North America, having questions about systemic systems, structural systems of oppression, how Black women are portrayed in the media, all these things that may not necessarily be at the forefront of our minds, but also, put Black women, particularly young Black girls, in a position of vulnerability that really hasn't been discussed to date. So I think this might even just be that starting conversation that we need to have moving forward within the anti-trafficking movement.
Absolutely, is a great follow-up. I've got a question here that says, do you have any data on how human trafficking affects Black women and girls? Because the data is general and does not offer information classified by population, which makes it possible to identify how the different groups are affected.
Yes, so that's sort of my big gripe is that we don't have data. We don't have race-based data to be able to understand the experiences, particularly of Black women and girls. All these sort of data that I've been able to find on these experiences are very US based. So within Canada, we don't have that data. So what oftentimes when people are talking about Black women's experiences, they're anecdotal. They're coming from service providers working on the front line who are seeing these things, but not coming from peer-reviewed sort of research, which oftentimes, and the reason why that's such a problem is peer-reviewed research, scientific data is oftentimes what policymakers look at, right? This is what funders look at when you want to sort of argue that we need funding for this group, for this population, to do this. Show me the graphs. Anyone who's had a meeting with government knows they want to see those graphs. They want to see those charts. And if you can't produce those, then oftentimes it's hard to make that argument that we need, services and care for this community.
So any researchers who are joining us today, take note, start the push for research and finding those numbers. Service providers, if you can start taking that kind of information down with the people you're providing services to. This is important information for us to have and for us to use in fighting for systemic changes, for policy changes, and for funding. So that is a concrete way that you can help add to the knowledge and the resources that we have in doing this work. Are there any other questions for Rhonelle? We've still got 10 minutes, and she's a very wonderful person to hear from. I've got a comment here. A very good presentation and very relevant, and linked to our work with newcomer refugees facing multiple experiences of trauma. Thanks a lot.
There's a raised hand. Fiorella, please unmute yourself and ask your question or comment.
Hi, everybody. Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
So thank you so much for this presentation. I learned a lot. There's something that got me thinking a lot about what you said about the modern day slavery term, because for me, so far, it had been precisely a way to highlight the continuity between slavery as a form of oppression and trafficking as a form of oppression, particularly like the historical connections between these two things, how, we can take history apart and say, oh, it's, like random that marginalized populations are more vulnerable to trafficking. It has a whole history of the bodies of marginalized people being, subject to like being the property of somebody else. And so it really got me thinking that all this other side that you saw in, how it can sort of backfire as a term. It's more a comment, a thought, and just wanted to share that. And if there's anything else you wanted to say, because for me, it was precisely a way to, reclaim the historical continuity. And what you're saying like sounds to me so relevant. And I would totally like to go and do my research, but yeah, I just wanted to share that thought. And again, thank you. It was like super enriching. And the discussion is being really interesting. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think, when I said, even myself, I had used that word modern day slavery. And I felt similar to you that it sort of connected that sort of exploitation of someone's body, that happened historically, that still happens today. But I think when we do the research, we recognize that this word has now sort of been co-opted. It's sort of been used to sort of minimize slavery, slave. And I've even heard, certain things like slavery still exists. Slavery didn't end, Abraham Lincoln didn't truly end slavery. You're like, wait a second, hold on. The slavery that existed, that Black people were experienced during chattel slavery, is nothing like human trafficking today. I mean, it isn't. And it doesn't minimize what human trafficking is today. It doesn't take away from the horror of it. It's not the same thing. Something that was race-based, that meant that just by being Black, you were a slave. And that was, again, I think the most important thing that was protected by a legal framework. Human trafficking is illegal. Slavery was legal. There were slave catchers that left the South, that went to the North to go and bring slaves back. This is not what we're seeing today with human trafficking. And I think by doing that, it starts to minimize that experience of slavery, that so many people, lost their lives, were brutalized and dehumanized for hundreds of years. And again, I had to do sort of my work with that term. And I just suggest people sort of do the research, and ask yourself, those kinds of questions as well too. But I came from the same place as you did too, so.
Thanks for that question and that answer, Rhonelle. We have another hand up from Jackie Ben John. Jackie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks so much for this wonderful presentation, Rhonelle. Very powerful. And I really wanted to just pick up on the last comments made by you and Fiorella, because I would agree. I can see the importance of connecting, especially in the anti-human trafficking movement, to connect Atlantic slave trade to human trafficking as a form of slavery. However, what is crucial is the missing history, the colonial context that surrounds the African slave trade, and the recognition, as Rhonelle, you've just beautifully framed it for us again in your response and during your presentation, how slavery was constituted in law. So when you don't bring forward that colonial history and connect it to the present day context, you will continue to see it as, calling slavery, and they're the same, and it's not. It's really conflating the two. And I think it's so important that we don't do that, and that if you have a deeper analysis, you would recognize that colonization played a key role in the slavery of Black people, which is very different from the slavery we have today, which is clearly, we have laws protecting people against human trafficking in our criminal justice systems globally, whereas the Atlantic slave trade is very different, which is why language is so important, but why it's also important for you to unlearn the misinformation that we've received through our educational system, essentially, because I think we would have that understanding, and this very active and growing movement in the area of anti-human trafficking would be aware of that and stop calling it, media included, stop calling it the modern day slavery. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. No, I mean, I think you hit everything that you said. And this is why I feel this webinar series is so important. This is why I think, Leah and Varka and the entire team, because this allows us to have these conversations that I know folks are having, on the side, they're having it, at the coffee table, they're having it over coffee, but coming together and having these conversations within the broader anti-trafficking movement and really sort of unpacking a lot of these unintended harms that are happening that we really need to do if we want to move forward to create a space that is really inclusive, but also recognizes that we can't have this sort of colorblind, one-size-fits-all approach to addressing trafficking. We have to recognize that human beings, individuals are unique. These intersecting identities, our experiences navigating the world that we live in are going to create different experiences, and we're going to need different potential interventions, different sort of aftercare, different supports. And I did see someone put in a comment about spirituality and sort of like, what does that mean, to expand on that? And I'll just say, within African culture, within Black culture, spirituality is very connected to our history and to our roots. And so understanding that and allowing that to be present in care. And if you yourself, may not know sort of what that looks like, that's an opportunity to ask your clients and to say, what do you need? What would be helpful for you? What type of, care or supports would you need? And allow them to sort of bring spirituality within their care. And that's just that that's just recognizing that, again, sort of the way that we do things and maybe what has been beneficial for us is not going to work for everybody else. And just to me, asking that question, what do you need? How can I support you? What does care look like for you? Can, I think, absolve a lot of those unintended harms.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rhonelle. That brings us to 3 o'clock. And I think we addressed all of the questions, so we will wrap up now. Folks have your contact information. Do encourage people, if you have follow-up questions or things that you want to connect with Rhonelle about, to do that. And I again encourage everyone to join us again next week for our next part of the series, which I'm reminding myself is it's not violence when police do it, state-sanctioned violence under the guise of anti-trafficking rescue. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, especially